just to give you an idea of what I've been with Element for about 25, 30 years. I used to run our asbestos labs in the UK. We employ, I don't know, 150 people or something in the asbestos labs in our UK. I have a number of qualifications from the UK, and when I moved out to the Middle East about 10 years ago, working for Element, and since then I've set up our asbestos testing labs in Fujairah. We have two, and the reasons for that will become a little bit more obvious later on. So we have two labs in Fujairah doing asbestos and one in Dubai. And since then, I've got the qualification from the Abu Dhabi Centre for Safety and Health for an asbestos management specialist, which again I'll talk a little bit more about later, as that scheme has kind of ground to a halt due probably to a bit of fraud. But welcome to the Middle East. A little bit about what we're going through. Hopefully it won't take too long. A bit of history of asbestos. I'm just going to go through that just to give you an idea that asbestos has been around for a long time, what its usage is, where you find it. A bit about the health hazards of asbestos. Clearly that's a major concern, and what those issues are. The legislation will be somewhat brief. There is a lot of legislation in the Middle East. There's a lot of in Abu Dhabi. As I said, the implementation and the policing of that legislation perhaps leaves a bit to be desired. A little bit more about yourselves, some asbestos in buildings. I said where you find it, what materials are made of asbestos, and then a bit about asbestos surveys, how to protect yourselves, how to look after buildings, and what sort of paperwork you need. And then hopefully by the end of that, we'll have a little 5 or 10 minutes on some questions and answers. So hopefully you'll find this interesting, and I believe there is a route to you raising questions during the meeting and sending them to Susan, and then we can discuss them later. If, however, anything suddenly springs to mind during this, then please feel free to button and ask. Pretty obvious thing if we're going to talk about asbestos. What is asbestos? Most people, and I'm sure I exclude you here, all of you here, but most people assume asbestos is some sort of man-made material that we invented and have been using for the last 30 years in building. It's not. Asbestos is a naturally occurring rock. It's a mineral that is found in two particular forms. One is called, two different groups. One is called the serpentine group, which is a bit of a misnomer because it contains one type of asbestos, and that is chrysotile. Chrysotile is commonly known as white asbestos because it is white, except when it's green, or blue, or purple, or orange. Chrysotile is the only type of asbestos that can be dyed. Its crystal structure has hydroxyl groups, so it is very hydrophilic. That's why it's used in cement manufacture so much. It holds the water to allow asbestos cement to cure, but it can be dyed. So do not be fooled or think for a minute that if you see something woven materials that are orange, that they may not be asbestos. The second group is called the amphibole group, and they contain the remaining 5 types of asbestos, as there are 6 recognized. Amosite, with a common name of brown asbestos, chrysidolite, common name blue, and then another 3 types of asbestos, anthophyllite, tremolite, and actinolite. The last 3 are not particularly commercially used at all. They have some issues with them, of course, the health issues. They appear in a number of places as contaminants, really. Tremolite is quite commonly found in the mountains in Ras Al Khaimah, Fujairah, as is chrysotile. So But it's the fact that these things are rocks, which makes them great for the purpose they use. It's rock, they are ground down into fibrous material. That is clearly rock, it's chemically resistant, it's fire resistant, it's heat resistant, and it is those particular properties that make it so good as a building material. It's unfortunate that it's exactly those same properties that cause it to be hazardous. Just a quick little brief through this. I'll let it run. It's just to give you an idea that it's been around for a long time. I said most people would assume that something that people invented in the 60s and 70s, but the earliest recorded use of asbestos, and this is a guesswork that it is asbestos, is in Roman times by Pliny, who wrote about the never-ending wick used in the temples of Vesta. Now that is almost certainly a case of woven chrysotile. It was noted by Marco Polo in China, where they used it in tablecloths, and quite usefully, once the tablecloths got dirty, they simply threw it into a fire. It burned everything else off, and they took the tablecloth back out. So it's been around a long time. Its first uses were in the early 19th century, in the 1800s, when it was used for insulation material. And you can see, if you follow that through here, in the UK, the first use in 1865, even in 1868 in roofing felt. So we're talking 150 years here that it's been in use, construction boards, and then it's obviously it became the wonder building material in the 60s and 70s. But you know, just because you might be dealing with buildings, although it's different in the UAE, there aren't that many old buildings, but just because taking a wider view that you're dealing with buildings that perhaps are older than the sort of 70s, there's no likelihood of asbestos. That is simply not true. The material has been around and been used for a great deal of time. It's used for completely banned in Europe in the UK in 1999. However, this is not the case in the Middle East. It became a little bit more flexible after that. Saudi was fairly strict. The UAE not so. So the Middle East continued to use this material for quite a long time. Dubai had a number of asbestos factories until relatively recently. It's still used in many countries. It's still mined in many countries around the globe. Just a couple of pictures there. Well, I can minimize that, move over there. A couple of pictures just out of interest. You can see I've seen there, for those of you of the Western persuasion, you can see a picture there from The Wizard of Oz in the 1930s, where they actually used chrysotile as snow. Johnson & Johnson there, a major lawsuit in America, globally, where for a great number of years, Johnson & Johnson produced talcum powder and baby powder, which was contaminated with tremolite. So that's been a bit of an issue. You can see the one on the bottom left there is from a mine in Russia that is still active, where they are mining asbestos. And to highlight the particular toxic and unpleasant properties of asbestos, the Russians decided the best thing they could do was to stamp it with a picture of Trump. So I think if that doesn't scare you, I'm not sure what will. Nope. Why is it not moving on now? Thank you. Anyway, yeah, clearly an obvious question. Why is asbestos dangerous? As I've said, it's a rock. It's resistant to chemicals, to heat, etc. So we have asbestos. Asbestos is the wonderful property, although it's a rock, it has the wonderful property that if you break it up, it cleaves down to smaller and smaller fibers. It cleaves along the unit cell and becomes finer and finer and finer. Now those fibers can become extremely small, microscopic, and they can be breathed in during disturbance. So the major health effects associated with asbestos are to do with the inhalation of airborne asbestos fibres. There are some health effects associated with ingestion of asbestos, but they're not so common. And people may ask, well, who on earth is going to eat asbestos? But if you happen to be in the US, um, the vast majority or a lot of their interstate water pipelines that were laid in the 50s and 60s and 70s, carrying water from some of the wetter areas to their arid states, are through chrysotile asbestos cement pipes, which slowly degrade and bleed asbestos into the water. So there is in fact even a World Health Organization limit for asbestos in drinking water for that particular reason. So as I said, the fibers themselves are crystalline, they're pieces of rock. When they get into your lungs, they are resistant, they will not biodegrade. They can sit there for years upon years. And as I said, they get down into finer and finer fibers. The reality is any asbestos fiber that you can actually see is not likely to cause a problem. Because it's a piece of rock, it will not remain airborne for very long, or even if it does, it will get trapped in your nose, and then it'll get trapped in the back of the throat and then expelled. It is very fine microscopic fibers that have the ability to travel all the way down into the lungs and right to the far end of the lungs, to the alveoli, where the gas transportation takes place. And they can sit there for many years and not be biodegrade. So they just sit there, they irritate the lung for years upon years. That can build up calcification, it can form all sorts of other issues and diseases, which can take anywhere from 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years before there is actually the occurrence of a disease. So trying to track back asbestos exposure is an extremely difficult thing. A couple of pictures there, unfortunately, post-mortem, which is really the only way to identify asbestosis or mesothelioma in the lungs. So, having said what the problem is, because I said that they can sit there for years. What are the most common diseases that are associated with asbestos? And the one that everyone knows about, or most people will have heard, is asbestosis. Asbestosis is actually a form of pneumoconiosis, which is a Greek word that quite literally means dust in the lung. So I think that kind of probably explains what this is. There are three types of pneumoconiosis: asbestosis, silicosis, and Minor's black lung disease. The other two forms, if someone is removed from that particular source, if they're a minor and they're taken out, or if they're a stonemason and they develop silicosis, if they're taken out of those environments, then there is every likelihood that there'll be some form of recovery, and they will not degrade any further. However, asbestosis is not like that. Once that's been diagnosed, yes, removing someone from the source of exposure will potentially help, and it will slow the progression of the disease, but invariably it is a fatal disease and can perhaps over 4, 5, 10 years, it will continue. So if there's any good news, I can assure you there is no one on this call, this meeting, who will catch this disease. It is a disease of asbestos workers, people who work with asbestos all the time, laggers, removal people, contractors, and it is dose related. The more exposure, the higher the exposure, the greater the risk of asbestosis. It is not really appropriate now for anyone on this call, as we are not asbestos workers. Again, it's associated with classic lung cancer, bronchocarcinoma. If you're exposed to asbestos regularly and smoke, then the risk factors increase almost exponentially. There are some other cancers of the gastrointestinal tract, as I said, and larynx, where people have ingested asbestos. Pleural plaques thickening conditions. Again, this is just where some of the the fibers sit in the lungs over many years, and what the body does to protect itself is build up calcium around that particular area, and that part of the lung is affected by what's known as a pleural plaque and becomes non-functional. Um, in reality, most of us have unless we're I don't know, an Olympic athlete have a great deal of excess capacity, 30-40% excess capacity in our lungs. So if small areas become non-functional, it's not a particularly serious issue. What is a serious issue is a disease called mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is there are two types, pleural and peritoneal. Principally associated with asbestos inhalation, pleural mesothelioma is a major killer. It is a cancer of the pleures, which is a lining of the lung. Without sounding dramatic or meaning to frighten anyone, mesothelioma has never been shown to be dose related. In theory, and I stress this only, in theory, a single exposure at any time to asbestos can result in a mesothelioma 5, 10, 15, 25 years later. Clearly, it's very difficult epidemiologically to prove that. How do you go to a doctors and say, oh, be diagnosed with mesothelioma, and say, oh yeah, I remember I was exposed to asbestos 28 years ago last Tuesday. As I said, in theory, a single exposure can result in mesothelioma. There is some evidence that the, the more often you are singly exposed to asbestos, the more likely that you'll develop mesothelioma. But as I said, that dose relationship is not completely confirmed as yet. That is the major cause of concern, because quite simply, this is how most people would become exposed these days, accidentally, and in drilling holes in walls, knocking down ceilings, changing pipes, this sort of stuff. So that is the major concern going forward. Again, just a couple of well, the first picture there is club fingers, which is a very common side effect of asbestosis. And the second one there is a picture of someone who has a combination of mesothelioma and asbestosis in an X-ray that is taken post-mortem. So, as I said, without scaring anyone, why is it still a problem? Well, at the moment, and again, I'm sorry if I'm just taking these figures from UK and Europe, where figures are readily available. They are not quite so available at all in the Middle East. So I think we have to take some sort of inference from these figures in the UK and extrapolate it if we can. Over 3,000 people die each year in the UK. It's the biggest industrial killer. More people still die in the UK from asbestos-related diseases than are actually killed on the roads. So, you know, it's very, very serious business. As I said, figures are not available for the Middle East, but you know, I think for us to say the problem doesn't exist would be complete nonsense. We know it does. One of the other things about asbestos, and we run across this, or I run across this quite a lot, is that people find it, and the first thing they want to do is start ripping it out and getting rid of it. Going back to what I said earlier, the major health issue associated with asbestos is the inhalation of asbestos fibres. Asbestos materials that are tightly bound, that are um, well covered, sealed, do not release asbestos. So, just because people find asbestos does not mean to say you immediately start hauling it out, where you may in fact be creating a problem where one doesn't exist. So that's worth mentioning. There's a lot of residual asbestos materials still in buildings, in the ground, quite often in some of the older sort of buildings where they decided to demolish them, with asbestos cement roofs and the like. All they did was knock them down and run them into the ground. So, there's still a lot of asbestos material out there. And as I said, there's continued accident exposure of various workers, electricians, plumbers, joiners, etc. That you guys may be sending out to do repairs on buildings. Unaware that asbestos exists, even for a few hours of some minor works, they may be exposed, and subsequently there is a possibility. I leave it at that. That in a few years' time or in many years' time, this could result in mesothelioma. So it is something to be very, very aware of. Just again, I'm talking here in Europe and UK and the US in the 50s to 80s. It was used extensively. In my experience in the Middle East, there is asbestos in buildings, but of course, a lot of the newer buildings are built without asbestos. But even in some of the more recent ones, I found asbestos materials where people had them lying around, so they've used them. So, it is still in existence, and you must still be very, very wary of it. Yes, who's at risk and why? As I said earlier, the largest single group are building and maintenance workers, people who are accidentally exposed to asbestos during works that you or I may send them in to do. We have a duty of care to these people to make sure that they are not harmed in any way by the actions that we're asking them to take place. So, plumbers, joiners, as I said, all of these type of people. It's a very major issue in the Middle East, where I'll come to legislation, but a lot of it exists, but very little of it is put into place. But that does not, in any shape or form, reduce our liability and a duty of care to anybody we send out to do work. Demolition is quite an interesting one. I've been called out to several sites in both UAE, both Abu Dhabi and Dubai, where asbestos was suspected prior to demolition, only to find out when I've got there, they've decided they couldn't be bothered waiting a few hours and the demolition has taken place. And the area is no longer safe. So you can see there these sort of things, just accidental. Clearly the first one, demolition. Second one, maybe refurbishment, accidental exposure. So, these are major issues, and these are the major routes for exposure now, that clearly we don't have an asbestos business making lagging or asbestos materials. A little bit. I mean, again, I apologise, guys, if I'm preaching to the converted here and you're aware of this, but I'll go through it quite quickly. Abu Dhabi is quite an interesting emirate. It has very significant and extensive regulation concerning asbestos. It's a complete and direct copy of UK regulation, right down to typographical and spelling mistakes in some places. It is put into place on some major projects, but generally not as a routine as smaller works. They don't seem to worry about it too much. It is very much a case of some very good, some very extensive regulation that will be brought to place on major projects where there are people looking, but perhaps it is not quite the case in smaller works or smaller contractors at all. Interestingly, they started up this asbestos technical specialist registration or asbestos management specialist, which I have, and then they have suspended it recently. I'm careful what I say, but the system was subject to internal audit and promptly closed. So I'll leave you to decide your own thoughts on that. Saudi, I should have put Dubai in there, but Saudi has good regulation. They follow US rather than UK procedures, a lot of NIOSH type work, etc. There is really good enforcement in the major global players there, the SABICs, the Aramcos, Ma'adens, etc. As part of corporate social responsibility, they really take it seriously. But again, on a sort of lower, smaller level, it's not used as the legislation is not enforced in sort of smaller works. Dubai, well, I'm very careful what I say about Dubai. Again, the legislation I referred to in Abu Dhabi is actually federal regulation, so should apply UAE wide. Dubai simply ignore it. They have some of their own regulation, and they do apply that for major projects. Anything else, I am not aware of, or it's very rare. When I said that in the last couple of years we've opened 2 labs in Fujairah, that's because as I said, the mountains in Fujairah and Ras Al Khaimah are of a particular type that contain chrysotile and to a lesser extent tremolite in the rock. And there are a number of major projects. Dubai have just started a project recently on the Hatta Dam, where they're building a hydroelectric power station. So there's a lot of blasting and drilling through those rocks. So we have a lab there. So they do take it seriously where there's international input and concern, otherwise perhaps not. Oman, well, very limited regulation. It depends purely on corporate social responsibility. Very quickly, I'll just go through this because I know time is moving on. Asbestos in buildings. What buildings may contain asbestos? Well, factories and offices and shops and hospitals, schools, recreational facilities, houses even. Basically, any building. Do not think that it's a hospital. They would have asbestos. They often do. Just very quickly to give you an idea of the types of asbestos in buildings, and I've done this in risk factor order. Remember, the risk associated with asbestos is its likelihood to become airborne and therefore inhaled. So there is a sort of spray coating called Limpet, which is actually sprayed on fire beams, structural beams for fire coating. This is usually about 85–90% asbestos with a binder in it. When it sets, the outside is fine. If that breaks, then the potential for fibre release is enormous, absolutely enormous. You can see there some broken beams, and underneath that, lying on the ground, is just loose asbestos. Extremely high potential for fibre release when damaged. Classic asbestos lagging that everybody knows about: pipes, boilers, pressure vessels, you name it. They can use anything in there, any types of asbestos in any sort of concentrations. Again, they are usually coated, sealed on the outside, but once that seal breaks, the potential for fibre release can be really quite high. Thermal fire protection, ceiling tiles, acoustic ceiling tiles, wall boards, etc. You can see that. Again, as long as they're sealed and intact, then they do not present a particular significant risk. They need to be managed, but it's not a risk. But clearly, in some of the older buildings or in buildings that are not well managed, then if these wall boards or tiles exist, they do become broken. And once they are broken, you will become, there is potential for exposure and release of asbestos fibres. They contain a great deal of fibre, some of these, anything up to 40% asbestos in the boards. And you can see that once they become broken, they are really friable. There is fibre release to a great deal of extent. You know, and again, if you're sending people in to fix, I don't know, light fittings or something on a wall, you know, if they're drilling through wall boards that are actually asbestos, they will release significant amounts of asbestos fibres and thereby be quite severely exposed. The classic asbestos cement. 95% of all asbestos usage in the world is in asbestos cement, or was in asbestos cement, of which 95% of that is chrysotile white asbestos. As I said, because of its hydrophilic properties, it allows asbestos cements to cure quite well. Prior to 1965-66, chrysotile blue asbestos was also used. Profile sheets, you know what they look like, be aware of them, you'll find them everywhere. Again, nicely intact, there's no particular issue with them apart from management, but often people decide they want to take them off, or they'll just get a hammer because they want to put a chimney or a pipe through them and smash through them. Of course, if you're doing that, you will release asbestos fibres. Just other things, bitumen products, sealants, ropes and yarns, asbestos fire blankets, mats, all sorts of things that contain asbestos. A texture coating, Artex, all of them, mastics. I'm just doing this briefly. It's just, you can see there's some woven asbestos fire textiles used as gaskets, used as on flues, fire blankets, asbestos tiles. There is no major issue associated health and safety wise, I think, with asbestos thermoplastic tiles. But if you're demolishing a building and you haven't removed these tiles, what you end up doing is contaminating whole loads of the demolition rubble that perhaps you may even have wanted to use as a resource for infill, and it now becomes a very, very expensive waste product to dispose of. Fuses, strangely, toilet cisterns, everything. You name it, asbestos can be in it. So just be aware of that. That you know, just because you think, oh no, don't be silly. Nobody would put asbestos in a toilet seat. They may very well have done so. So, as I said, hopefully, well, I've not worried anyone too much, but you know, clearly there's a lot of potential for asbestos materials out there. Clearly, there are some very, very significant health issues associated with exposure to asbestos fibres. How do we best prevent that? Clearly, one of the ways to do that is to reduce the main way is to reduce the exposure of people to any airborne fibres. And if I go back to what I said previously, where currently with how we are now in this day and age, the major exposure of people to asbestos is accidental maintenance workers. So effectively, how do we protect those workers and visitors? One of the best ways to do that is to carry out asbestos surveys. You can use these surveys for all sorts of reasons, but clearly one of the most important is in managing any asbestos you find. The first part of it is to check if you have asbestos or not. So that's a major importance. If we don't know, as I said, if you don't know you have asbestos and you send people in and tell them to knock a hole in your ceiling, then you don't know what the consequences of that may be. There are different types of asbestos surveys, and as I said, I'm quoting here from well, what was the UAE guidance, sorry, UK guidance, but that the UK guidance has now changed, but they haven't actually changed the UAE guidance. But I'm talking in general terms there from European legislation. Obviously, if people go out doing surveying, they can do a combination of taking samples or presuming them, or looking and visual inspection. But you know, someone will need to decide if you're doing any refurbishment works or demolition, the extent of these works. There are two main types of surveys. A management survey, which is used for managing any asbestos that you find in used or occupied buildings that are still in use. As I said, part of that management process may be to remove the asbestos, or it may be to leave in situ, as that is safer, and simply monitor and manage its condition and its exposure. And again, if you know that perhaps a certain ceiling or wall is asbestos, then you can inform any particular maintenance workers to either not work on those areas or take the appropriate precautions that need to be there. Doing management surveys will involve some minor intrusive works, lifting ceiling tiles, looking above ceilings, under floors. Essentially, it will find any readily available asbestos. The second type of surveys are more intrusive, the refurbishment stroke demolition. This will involve a much more intrusive survey. Clearly, if you're going to demolish a building, you want to find everything in it. Just some quick look through theirs. A management survey, we look at all readily accessible areas, walls, pipes, ceilings, etc. We'll include some caveats. Clearly, there'll be some areas where it may be not applicable to access if you have solid ceilings rather than lift out ceiling tiles. They would not be breached in a management survey, but there would be a caveat to say that those areas above them have not been inspected. That's actually a clear difference between that and a demolition survey, where those particular solid ceilings and solid walls would be breached to see what was behind them. As I said, management surveys identify all readily available, and they will provide an information on the condition of any asbestos containing materials that are found, and recommendations as to what to do, which may be remove, it may be monitor, it may be repair, and you can use that to form an asbestos management plan for each of the buildings. But if asbestos is remaining in situ and being managed, then clearly there should be re-inspection surveys on a regular basis, at least annually, to check if there's been any deterioration in the in situ materials. Refurbishment, as I said, used to locate all ACMs. You're talking about taking sledgehammers through walls. It's incredibly destructive. So please don't ask someone to do a demolition survey or a refurbishment and then come in later and complain that there's a hole in your wall, can you fix it? That's not what it's all about. Clearly, again, health and safety issues there. It's a team of people, it's not individuals. Services should be disconnected, etc. So all of that needs to be looked at. A refurbishment is essentially a limited demolition area where if you're refurbishing a particular room or a small area, then you carry out essentially a limited demolition survey there. But again, all of that, the extent of those surveys need to be agreed with all parties, safety officers, the refurbishment team. to make sure that the correct areas are accessed and looked at. As I said, these surveys are destructive and aggressive. Oh, sorry, I won't even go through this because basically that's us, element, 6 or 7,000 people in 30 countries. So, right, well, it's not like that. I know we're a bit short of time, so I apologise if, as I said, I went through that a little bit quick laterally, but I think hopefully that's given you some idea of what where asbestos is, what its issues are, and perhaps how you can best manage it. I think that's all for me at the moment, and I'll hand you back to Susan.
Actually, it's Peter, actually, Alex, but never mind.
Oh, sorry, Peter.
Feel free to call me Susan. Thank you, Alex. Excellent presentation, really informative. And I think it built very well on Charles' presentation from a couple of months ago. Now, as Alex says, questions and answers, or questions at least. Susan, have we had any comments or questions in the comments box?
No, we don't have any questions at the moment. If anybody wants to ask a question, please could you write it on the chat function, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Okay, excellent. In the meantime, then, I shall just extend my thanks once again to Alex. Thank you very much for that, Alex. Excellent presentation, really informative. And I think it highlights just what hazardous material we're dealing with in terms of asbestos, and the need for that care, that foresight, and that planning in terms of risk management. So on behalf of the branch and our members, thanks once again.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
There's 3 questions. Firstly, are there any specific regulations as asbestos removal and disposal in the UAE?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, there are quite extensive federal regulations from Abu Dhabi and from OSHAD, the Safety and Health Centre in Abu Dhabi. They go into a lot of detail in terms of who can remove asbestos, what to do with it, etc. So if you go onto the OSHAD website, you will be able to download all of them. As I said, the enforcement of them is perhaps another matter, but clearly there's some very, very good guidance there in terms of how to do things and how to do things safely and how to follow the law. There are a number of licensed asbestos tips, landfill tips in the UAE. Not many, but there are 3 or 4. And any asbestos removal works or any asbestos contaminated material must go into those licensed tips, which is why I was saying earlier, be careful if you're demolishing something that you don't end up contaminating your demolition rubble with asbestos, because landfilling that into one of these few licensed tips is a very expensive process.
Yes, I'm sure it is. In addition to that, my understanding is that the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi take the lead on management of asbestos. I don't know if you're aware or you have any understanding of that.
Yeah. Well, we have a 3-year contract with the Environment Agency in Abu Dhabi to perform a lot of monitoring and testing. So.
Okay. Are there any other questions, Susan?
Lastly, are there any regulations concerning requirement asbestos management plan?
In the unfortunate danger of repeating myself, the federal regulations do in fact require the preparation of management plans. As I said, it's a complete and utter rip-off of UK regulation from about 2005. Down to spelling mistakes, but that, when it first came out maybe 5-6 years ago, put in a timescale for the asbestos management plans of existing buildings of about 3 or 4 years. But as far as I'm aware, that has never been followed up on. But again, you know, just because the regulation is not being enforced does not in any shape or form reduce our duty of care to people that we send into work, or for that matter, people in our own premises. I mean, I don't know. Element have something like, I don't know what we've got in the Middle East and Asia, maybe 20 or 30 labs, and I have personally been round them all doing asbestos surveys on our own premises, just to ensure that although we're not going to get prosecuted by the authorities because they don't enforce the law, that does not in any shape or form reduce our duty of care on our own employees.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you once again for the presentation.
Okay, no problem at all. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Okay, Susan, if you can make me presenter again, I can wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we move towards the end of today's branch meeting, I'll just quickly go through any other business. Once again, I will peddle the merchandise. We have polo shirts in black and white available, as well as baseball caps and mugs. If people are interested, then please drop me a message on WhatsApp or message the group. And social media and communications, the WhatsApp group is available to join, although I think spaces may be limited. It can be joined via a link, so if you're unable to join in the traditional way, you can get in touch with us and we can share the link with you and you can join that way. We have a Twitter handle, ME_IIRSM, and you can also communicate with us by email. It's our UAE branch at IIRSM.org email address. And of course, we have our website, LinkedIn page, and YouTube channels. And that concludes branch meeting for this afternoon. Thank you very much for your time and attendance and for your attentiveness. Next meeting, I did double check the date this time. The astute and observant ones of you will notice I got the next meeting date wrong last month. So next meeting will be the first Wednesday of October, and that will be the 6th. And I look forward to meeting you there, and close by wishing you all a very healthy and safe evening.